Don't you worry your pretty little head about the details, Aunt Eleanor. It's just routine tax stuff. My nephew Mark said that to me right in my own kitchen. The room smelled of old wood and the lemon polish I'd used that morning. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Mark had never called me pretty a day in his life. He stood there, leaning against the counter my husband Robert had built, and his smile didn't touch his eyes. This farm was everything Robert and I had worked for. It was more than land. It was a promise. And Mark's voice was the sound of a promise about to be broken. I just nodded, looking down at my worn linoleum floor. I didn't want him to see the sudden fear in my eyes. Mark's brother, David, hovered by the back door. He wouldn't look at me, just stared at his own scuffed boots like they held all the answers. The hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence between us. Mark slid a thick stack of papers across the oak table. The pages whispered as they moved over the wood grain. "We need this signed for the county by Friday," he said. He clicked his ballpoint pen, a sharp little sound of impatience. The stack looked heavy, important. It looked like the kind of thing you shouldn't sign without understanding every single word. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the soft wool of my sweater. Friday was only 2 days away. I could almost hear my Robert's voice, clear as the church bells on Sunday morning. "Never sign what you haven't read, Ellie." He'd told me that 1,000 times. "I can't seem to find my reading glasses," I said, my voice quiet. I patted the pockets of my apron for show. It was a lie, of course. My glasses were right there on the counter by the cookie jar. I just needed a moment to breathe, to think. Mark let out a puff of air, a sigh so full of condescension it felt like a slap. "Fine," he snapped, snatching the papers back so fast it made me jump. "We'll come back tomorrow. Have your glasses ready." The next morning, the house was too quiet. I found a letter on my kitchen counter that hadn't been there when I went to bed. It was a past due notice for the property tax, left helpfully, where I couldn't miss it. I sat down at the table and unfolded it. My hands trembled a little. The amount printed in stark black ink made my breath catch in my throat. It was thousands more than I had planned for, more than I had in my savings account. A wave of pure panic washed over me, cold and sharp. For the first time, I felt truly old, like a boat that had lost its anchor in a storm. Was this real, or was this part of their plan? I couldn't tell. The phone rang just after lunch, its shrill sound cutting through my worry. It was my daughter, Sarah, calling from 3 states away. My heart lifted for a moment, but it sank just as quickly. "Mum, I spoke with Mark," she said, her voice full of that practical tone she used when she thought I was being difficult. "He said he's just trying to help you get your affairs in order." I looked out the window at the fields Robert and I had ploughed together. They were bare for the winter, waiting. "Sarah, it's more complicated than that." "Is it?" she asked. "He's family, Mum. He said you're getting overwhelmed. Just let him and David help. Trust your cousins." After I hung up, the silence in the kitchen was heavier than before. My own daughter. It was a loneliness so deep, it felt like a physical ache in my chest. I was completely on my own. That Sunday, the air in the church basement was thick with the smell of baked beans and perfume. I brought my 7-layer salad. It was always a hit. I was setting it down on the long folding table when Bill Henderson from down the road came over. He balanced a paper plate loaded with ham. "Eleanor, good to see you," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Heard you might be looking to unload the farm. Mark was asking me what a parcel like yours might go for these days." My hand froze on the serving spoon. The clatter of forks and chatter of the congregation seemed to fade away. Oh? He was just asking for curiosity, I'm sure. Well, he told me you were getting a little frail, said you were failing and couldn't manage the paperwork anymore. Bill patted my arm. His touch meant to be kind. Don't you worry. We all get there. He walked away, leaving me standing there with my salad and a brand new coat of public shame. The next afternoon they were back. Mark's car crunched on the gravel driveway, and my stomach twisted into a knot. This time, they brought a young woman with them and a white pastry box from the grocery store. The notary, Mark announced. She looked barely 20 and wouldn't meet my eyes. We brought you a treat, Aunt Eleanor, David said, placing the box on the oak table. It smelled of sugar and shortening. We just want to make this official and easy for you, Mark said. His smile was a thin, stretched thing. He pushed the papers toward me again, along with a blue ballpoint pen. The notary girl cleared her throat and looked at the ceiling. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling just a little. I looked at Mark's expectant face, then at David's, who was studying a crack in the linoleum. My heart hammered against my ribs. I let out a little gasp, my eyes going wide. The pen slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the floor. "Oh my," I whispered, pressing a hand to my chest. "I just feel so dizzy all of a sudden." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the big bed Robert and I had shared for 47 years, staring at the ceiling. The old house groaned around me, settling into the cold night air. The moonlight cast long shadows across the worn quilt, the one his mother had stitched for us as a wedding present. I remembered Robert standing by the window, looking out at these same fields. "This land is our promise, Elle," he'd said. "It remembers everything we put into it." He was right, and my nephews weren't trying to help me. They were trying to erase that promise. Lying there in the dark, with the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs, I understood. This wasn't help. It was a siege. The next morning, I did something small. I called the Social Security Administration. I just wanted to hear a voice that wasn't telling me what I couldn't do. The line crackled, and then a polite young woman answered. "Social Security, how can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was calm and professional. "I'd just like to confirm my monthly benefit amount, please," I said, my own voice sounding stronger than I expected. She asked for my information, and I gave it to her, clear and steady. She told me the exact amount, down to the cent. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mom?" she asked. She called me Mom. It was a small thing, but it felt like a dam breaking inside me. A stranger on a government phone line had just shown me more respect than my own blood relatives. There was a message on my answering machine when I got back from the grocery store. The little red light was blinking insistently. I pressed the button, and Mark's voice filled my quiet kitchen. It was smooth as butter, but cold underneath. "Aunt Eleanor, I hope you're feeling better," he began. Then the chill came. "Mom would be so disappointed in you, making things difficult like this. We're just trying to protect the family legacy." The family legacy. My husband's sweat and my own were the legacy, not some number in a developer's bank account. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the hum of the machine after his words ended. Then, with one firm press of my finger, I erased the message. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the long, sleeping rows of my fields. The fight had begun. I drove the papers over to my friend Martha's house that afternoon. Martha was a retired paralegal from my church, and her mind was still as sharp as a brand new tack. Her little house always smelled of Earl Grey tea and cinnamon, and everything was in its proper place. not a speck of dust on her coffee table. She poured me a cup of tea, the steam warming my cold hands. "So, what's all this, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice kind. I pushed the thick stack of papers across her polished table. "Mark and David want me to sign these. They said it's just tax stuff, but it doesn't feel right." Martha put on her half-moon reading glasses and picked up the top page. The grandfather clock in her hallway ticked softly, the only sound in the room. She read for a minute, then another. She flipped a page, then another. Her pleasant smile slowly faded, replaced by a grim, tight line. She looked up at me over the rim of her glasses, and her eyes were dark with worry. "Eleanor," she said, her voice low, "this isn't a tax form. This is a quitclaim deed." I just looked at her. The words didn't mean anything to me. "A what?" "It means you would be giving up your rights to the farm," she said, tapping the paper with her finger. "You would be signing the entire property, all 300 acres, the house, the barns, everything, over to them." She flipped to the last page and pointed at a line. "And do you see what they're giving you in return?" I leaned in to read the tiny print. It said, "For the sum of $1. $1. The air left my lungs in a rush. The teacup rattled in its saucer as I set it down. Robert's legacy. Our home. My entire life. All for one single dollar. The betrayal was so deep and so sudden, it felt like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to help. They were trying to erase me. I looked out Martha's window at her tidy rose bushes. But I didn't see them. I saw my own fields, the ones Robert and I had walked 1,000 times. I would not let them be stolen. I wouldn't just refuse. I would fight. The next day, I drove into town. I walked right into the big electronics store, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft whoosh. The air inside was cold and smelled like new plastic. A young man with kind eyes asked if he could help me. "I need a voice recorder," I told him. "A simple one. Very simple." He showed me a small black device that fit in the palm of my hand. "This one is easy," he explained. "You just slide this button up to record and down to stop. See the little red light? That means it's working." I bought it and walked back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat in the big, sunny parking lot and practiced. I slid the button up. The tiny red light blinked on. "My name is Eleanor Vance," I said, my voice trembling just a little. "The date is October 26th. I played it back. It sounded clear. I took a deep breath and was about to try again when I saw a familiar dusty green pickup truck drive past my row. It was David's. I slid down in my seat, my heart thumping against my ribs until he was gone. That evening, I picked up the phone. I took a few deep breaths, trying to make my voice sound shaky and old, the way they thought I was. I called Mark's cell phone. "Mark, dear, it's your Aunt Eleanor," I said, putting a little quaver in my voice. "I've been thinking about those papers. I think I'm ready to sign them." I could almost hear the greedy smile on the other end of the line. "That's wonderful, Auntie. We knew you'd see it was for the best." "There's just one thing," I said, letting my voice trail off. "It's all so confusing for me. Could you and David come over tomorrow and just explain it to me one more time? Slowly?" I looked at the little black recorder on my kitchen table. They mistook my grey hair for a white flag. I knew they wouldn't be able to resist. They arrived the next morning, right at 10 o'clock. They were smug and smiling, and Mark was carrying a fancy white box from the bakery downtown. He set it on the table. "A little something sweet for our favourite aunt," he said, His smile was as fake as a $3 bill. "That's so thoughtful," I said, motioning for them to sit. My ceramic cookie jar, shaped like a little cottage, was already on the table, right between us. The lid was slightly ajar. "Now, about these papers. You said they were for taxes." Mark opened his briefcase with a loud snap. He spread the documents out. "That's right. It's just a formality for the county. It just puts us on the account to help you manage the bills, pay the taxes from our bank. It makes things simpler for everyone." I leaned forward, pretending to be confused. "So my name stays on everything?" "Of course," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "This just lets us help you. You know, a formality for the bank." From inside my cookie jar, a tiny red light was glowing, a secret beacon of hope, capturing every single lie. David chimed in then, his voice softer but just as sharp. "It's what's best for you, Auntie. You can't handle all this anymore." He tried to pat my hand, but I moved it to my lap before he could touch me. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating like the summer humidity before a storm. I just nodded slowly, my eyes on the cookie jar. After they left, after the sound of their truck faded down the long gravel drive, I finally let out the breath I was holding. My hands trembled as I reached into the jar and pulled out the little black recorder. I sat there at my kitchen table, the one Robert built with his own 2 hands, and I pressed play. I listened to the whole thing, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was a mix of fear and a fury so cold and pure, it felt like ice in my veins. The next morning, I drove Martha to see a lawyer she knew. The office was in a clean brick building downtown and smelled of floor polish and serious business. The lawyer, a woman named Ms. Albright, had sharp eyes and hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. She didn't smile much. We sat in her quiet office, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound. I placed the little recorder on her big, shiny desk. "I'd like you to hear something," I said. She listened, her face perfectly still, not a flicker of surprise. When it was over, she pressed stop and looked at me. "This is elder abuse," she said, her voice flat and certain, "and it is beautifully recorded." She looked from me to Martha. "They really thought you'd fall for this." A strange calm washed over me. "They mistook my kindness for weakness," I told her. "It's a common mistake, and it is always expensive." Ms. Albright finally allowed herself a small, thin smile. She tapped her pen on a legal pad. "Well, Eleanor," she said, "they want the farm. But selling isn't your only option. Have you ever considered a long-term lease?" That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my computer, the screen glowing in the dark kitchen, and looked up the name Ms. Albright had given me, the Prairie Women's Agricultural Cooperative. Their website was simple, full of pictures of young women with dirt under their fingernails and bright, hopeful smiles. They were holding baskets of vegetables and standing next to healthy-looking cows. I read their mission statement. It was all about stewardship, community, and sustainability. Words Robert and I had used 1,000 times, sitting on the porch swing, planning a future that was supposed to last forever. They weren't developers looking to pave over our life's work. They were farmers. They wanted to care for the land, not just own it. A little knot of tension in my chest, one I hadn't even noticed, began to loosen. A few days later, I met the co-op's director. Her name was Sarah, and she drove up in a dusty pickup truck that looked just as hard-working as she did. She had kind eyes and hands that were calloused from real work, not from a fancy manicure. We didn't sit in the stuffy parlor. Instead, we walked the fields. I pointed out the low spot that always flooded in the spring and the patch of land by the creek where the soil was richest. She didn't talk about property values or zoning. She crumbled the dirt between her fingers and talked about soil quality, cover crops, and rotational grazing. "Your husband built this land up right," she said, looking out over the west pasture. "You can feel it." For the first time since Robert died, I felt a flicker of real hope for the future of this place. It felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. The next week, I started my little tests. I needed to see if I had the nerve to see this through. The phone rang on Tuesday afternoon, and the caller ID showed Mark's name. My stomach did a little flip, but I picked it up. His voice was syrupy sweet, the way it always was when he wanted something. "Hi, Aunt Eleanor," he said. "Just calling to see if you've had a chance to look over those papers. David and I can swing by any time to pick them up." I took a deep breath and looked out the kitchen window at Robert's old red barn. "Actually, Mark," I said, my voice as calm and even as a glassy pond, "I'm having my lawyer review the documents." There was a silence on the other end of the line. It was so complete, so sudden. I thought for a second he had hung up. Ms. Albright's office smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The lease agreement was thick and heavy in my hands, a solid weight of promises. It was a beautiful document, full of words like stewardship and soil preservation. Ms. Albright slid a pen across her mahogany desk. It was a fancy fountain pen, not like the cheap plastic one Mark had tried to give me. "This ensures the land is only used for organic farming," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And it can't be broken or sold to a developer for 99 years. It's ironclad, Eleanor." I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I signed my name on the line, the ink a dark, final blue. For the first time since my Robert passed, I felt like I was the one in charge of my own life. A sense of power, quiet and warm, settled over me. It felt like coming home. The week leading up to Thanksgiving was a flurry of activity. The whole house smelled of cinnamon and sage from my baking. I polished the silver until it gleamed, the familiar scent of the polish catching in my throat. It was a tradition, getting the house ready for the whole family. But this year felt different. My daughter, Sarah, was flying in. The nephews and their families were driving up. I set the long dining table with my best china, the plates Robert and I had received for our wedding. In the bottom drawer of the heavy oak sideboard, beneath the linen napkins, I placed two things. The first was the signed lease, tucked inside a thick manila envelope. The second was the little digital recorder. The stage was set. I just had to wait for my guests to arrive. The house was full of noise. Laughter from the living room, where a football game was on the television. The clatter of plates and silverware from the dining room. The air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey and melting butter. My nephews, Mark and David, sat on either side of their mother, looking pleased with themselves. Mark stood up, tapping his water glass with a fork for attention. He raised his glass for a toast. "To family," he said, his voice booming, "and to taking care of our elders, making sure they're safe and secure." He looked right at me, a smug little smile on his face. The hypocrisy was so thick I could have sliced it with my turkey knife. I just smiled back, a small, polite smile, and took a tiny sip of my iced tea. After the pumpkin pie was served, I stood up. The scraping of my chair legs on the wood floor was just loud enough to make the chatter die down. Everyone looked at me. It was unusual for me to make a speech. "I have an announcement to make," I said. My voice was clear, not a tremble in it. I walked over to the sideboard and took out the small black Bluetooth speaker I'd bought. I set it right in the middle of the table, next to the gravy boat. Mark watched me, a confused frown on his face. David wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mark, David," I said, looking from one to the other. "You've both been so concerned about the farm lately. I think everyone should hear just how you plan to help." I reached into my apron pocket, my finger finding the little button on my phone, and then I pressed play. Mark's voice filled the stunned silence. It was smooth and condescending, just as I remembered. "Just puts us on the account to help you manage the bills. A formality for the bank." My daughter Sarah's face turned pale. Across the table, my sister-in-law, the boy's mother, stared at the speaker as if it were a snake. One of the cousins dropped his fork, and it hit his plate with a loud clank. No one seemed to notice. Then came David's voice, softer, full of fake pity. "What's best for you, Auntie? You can't handle all this anymore." My daughter's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The recording captured every lie, every ounce of their disrespect. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Mark lunged across the table for the little speaker, his face a mask of purple rage. He knocked over a glass of water, and it spread silently across the good tablecloth. But my hand was quicker. I picked up the speaker and held it to my chest. "It's just a copy, Mark," I said, my voice as calm as a summer morning. "The original is with my lawyer." He froze, his hand hovering over the wet spot. Across the table, his brother David just crumpled. He put his head in his hands and started to sob, his shoulders shaking. The sound was ugly and loud in the quiet room. The recording played out, every last greedy, condescending word. When it finished, the only sound was David's weeping and the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. I looked at each face around my dining room table. My daughter, Sarah, looked like she'd seen a ghost. My sister-in-law, their mother, stared at me with pure venom. It was time for the second half of my announcement. I took a deep breath, the air still thick with the smell of roasted turkey. "Since I am clearly too incompetent to manage the farm," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I've leased it, for the next 99 years, to the Prairie Women's Agricultural Cooperative." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You did what?" The room exploded. It was like a dam had broken. Mark started shouting, calling me a crazy old woman. His mother was on her feet, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You monster, Eleanor. That's your nephew's birthright. Robert would be spinning in his grave." I stood my ground, my old bones feeling stronger than they had in years. I looked right at her. "The farm is safe," I said. "Its purpose is secure. That is all that matters." My husband Robert had loved this land for what it was, not for what it was worth. I knew he wouldn't be spinning. He would be proud. My daughter Sarah pulled me by the arm, leading me into the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed very loud. Dirty plates were stacked by the sink, a monument to a dinner that was now ruined. She closed the door behind us and leaned against it, her eyes wide with hurt and confusion. "Mum, why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my only child, at the daughter who lived 3 states away and only called on holidays. I didn't say it with anger. I just said the simple truth. "You told me to trust them," I replied. The words just hung there in the air between us, plain and heavy as a stone. Mark and David's families were the first to leave. There was no goodbye, just the scrape of chairs, the angry slam of the front door, and the sound of car engines roaring to life in the driveway. Headlights cut across the living room windows, and then were gone. My sister-in-law left without a word, her face a tight knot of fury. A few cousins stayed behind. They came into the kitchen one by one, mumbling apologies, saying they had no idea. I nodded and accepted their words, but a little wall had gone up around my heart. I knew now who saw me as a person, and who saw me as a problem to be managed. The next morning, the old black telephone on the kitchen wall rang so hard it seemed to shake the wallpaper. I knew who it was before I picked it up. Mark's voice was tight and ugly, like a wire pulled too thin. He didn't even say hello. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," he hissed. "You can't do this. That land has been in the family for 100 years. I held the receiver a little away from my ear and looked out the window at the quiet fields. The sun was just coming up, turning the frost on the grass to silver. "Go ahead, Mark," I said. My voice was as calm as the morning. I was just quoting what Ms. Albright had told me to say. "The discovery process will be very interesting. We can start with this recording." There was a sputtering sound on the other end of the line, like a car that wouldn't start. Then a sharp click. He'd hung up. I put the phone back in its cradle. The only sound in the kitchen was the low hum of the refrigerator. I knew he would not call back. My daughter, Sarah, stayed for another week. It was a quiet time. We didn't talk about the big Thanksgiving blow-up right away. Instead, we fell into old rhythms. We washed the good china by hand, the warm, soapy water feeling good on my skin. We sat at the kitchen table and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, just like we used to when she was a girl. One afternoon, while we were folding laundry, she finally spoke. "I'm so sorry, Mum. I should have listened to you." The words were small, almost lost in the scent of warm cotton from the dryer. "You told me to trust them," I said, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. It was the truth, and it had to be said before we could move on. She just nodded, her eyes full of tears. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it felt like the beginning of something new, something a little more honest. The first truck from the co-op arrived on a Tuesday. It was an old blue pickup, rattling up the drive with two young women in the cab. They hopped out wearing muddy boots and flannel shirts, their handshakes firm and their eyes clear. They didn't treat me like a fragile piece of glass. They treated me like the owner of the land they were about to work. "The well pump sounds a little rough, Mrs. Gable," the taller one named Josie said after about an hour. "We can take a look at it this afternoon if you'd like." That night, for the first time in years, I fell asleep to the sound of purposeful work on the farm, the distant clang of a hammer on metal. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was breathing again, full of a quiet, steady purpose. I found a new routine. I'd have my coffee on the porch swing each morning, wrapped in my old quilt, and watch the women work. They moved with an energy that warmed my old bones. One day, I remembered Robert's old farming journals tucked away in a chest in the attic. I brought them down. The paper was brittle and smelled of dust and time. I handed a leather-bound book to Josie. My Robert kept notes on everything: soil, rain, what he planted where. Her face lit up as she traced his faded handwriting. His notes on cover crops. "This is incredible. This is exactly what we needed." They started calling me over to ask questions, to hear stories about the old days. I wasn't the lonely widow in the farmhouse. I was a mentor. When November came around again, I didn't dread it. I planned a new kind of Thanksgiving. There was no big, bloated turkey and no tense silence. I invited Martha, Ms. Albright, and all the women from the co-op. We roasted 2 chickens from their own flock and cooked squash and potatoes they had pulled from the earth with their own hands. The farmhouse was filled with the smell of rosemary and fresh bread. Laughter echoed off the old wooden walls, real and easy. We sat around the long oak table. a patchwork group of young and old, and raised our glasses of apple cider. This was my family now, a family chosen, built on the solid ground of respect. A week later, a letter arrived with David's messy handwriting on the envelope. I opened it at the kitchen table, the paper thin and cheap in my hands. It was a long, rambling apology, full of excuses about Mark and money and how he never meant for it to go so far. A few spots on the page were blurred, as if a tear had fallen there. I read it once, then folded it neatly and put it in a drawer with old bank statements. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a quiet pity for a man who would always be led by someone stronger. His weakness was a prison he had built for himself. Later that afternoon, I was watering my porch ferns when I saw a cloud of dust down the long driveway. A silver sedan I didn't recognize was making its way toward the house. My heart gave a little thump. It wasn't the co-op, and it wasn't Martha. I set down my watering can and waited, a strange feeling of calm settling over me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I just wondered who was coming to my door now. It was my sister-in-law, Susan, Mark and David's mother. She looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen her at Thanksgiving, her face drawn and tired. She stood on my porch steps and wouldn't meet my eye. The air hummed with the sound of cicadas. "Can I come in, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice raspy. I held the screen door open for her. We sat in the living room, in the same chairs her sons had sat in when they tried to steal my life. She twisted the strap of her purse. "I'm sorry," she finally said, the words coming out in a rush. I knew Mark was greedy. I knew he was pushing David. I didn't want to see it. I looked at her, at this woman I had known for 50 years. "You saw it, Susan," I said, not with anger, but with a simple clarity. "You just hoped it would work." She started to cry then, quiet, defeated sobs, and I knew it was over, all of it. With the first check from the lease agreement, I walked into the county tax office and paid the bill in full. The woman behind the counter gave me a polite smile. "Have a nice day, Mom," she said. It felt good. The next check paid for a new roof, and I loved the sound of the hammers on the shingles all week. It was the sound of security. Martha and I sat on my porch with a catalogue of bus tours. "What about seeing the fall colours in Vermont?" she asked, pointing to a picture of a red and gold mountainside. "Why not?" I said, feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The money wasn't for fancy things. It was for this, the simple freedom to say yes. My daughter and I spoke on the phone every Sunday now. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't have to. Instead, she'd ask me questions Robert used to answer. "Mum, what's the best way to keep deer from eating my hostas?" she asked one evening. "And my tomatoes have some kind of blight on the leaves." The next day, a picture arrived on my phone. It was a snapshot of 3 pots on her apartment balcony, a straggly tomato plant in one of them. Underneath, she had written, "It's not a farm, but it's a start." I smiled. The real family legacy wasn't about acres of land. It was about learning how to grow something for yourself. The evening air was warm and smelled of freshly cut hay. I sat on my porch swing, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. The new roof was a dark, solid line against the lavender sky. Down by the barn, I could hear the sound of women's voices, punctuated by a burst of laughter that carried on the breeze. They were checking on the new chickens, their work for the day done. This land was alive. It was cared for, and so was I. I took a slow sip of my tea and watched the first stars appear. I was the keeper of Robert's promise, the quiet queen of my 80 acres. My peace was my own, and it was the richest harvest I had ever known.